I always have my ear tuned in for buzzwords. Buzzwords are things that I despise, and so I hear them, and I'm like, oh, that's going to be a phrase we have to hear for a while. And there's one that I've heard more and more, and but I heard it before the situation that we're in, and it's just become one of those things where people like to use a new phrase that they've learned, and so now we have to hear it. And a lot of times people don't have any idea what the phrase means that they're using, or if it even applies. But the one that we talk about today is the phrase best practices. You've heard that. As we're going to reopen, you should use best practices and so on and so forth. And a lot of people don't realize what best practices really means. It sounds great. Best practices put into place the things that tend to work. And I'm not saying that the phrase should be discounted entirely. Obviously, you want to do what seems to be working the best, which logically that's what it sounds like it means. But best practices, and I'll illustrate this a couple of ways, tends to be things that we look at in the short term. And this is the flaw with best practices, is that when people are figuring out what best practices are, they look at the short term of what's worked. And so since this seems to have worked, let's keep doing it. Which I suppose is better than this seems to not be working, let's keep doing it. That's the definition of insanity. But the problem is that our best practices tend to be very short term. For example, as we look at the situation that we're in right now, what we're saying is best practices are the hygiene. Well, hygiene, we don't want to insult hygiene. That's good. Use masks wherever you go, and don't leave your house unless you absolutely have to. That's a thing. And so we have all of the things that this 6 feet social distancing, keep 6 feet, and so when you open up your place of business, make sure that your cubicles are set up so that no one has to be near each other. The coffee maker shouldn't. You should have all that area closed off so people can't congregate, and you have to kind of raise your flag to go to the bathroom, whatever it is, right? These are best practices. Now, here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that we don't really know what best practices are yet. This particular situation is fairly new to us, and we don't have a lot of data except for a couple of months to know if this is actually best practices or not. We're looking at this, we're kind of throwing a dart at the wall based on a couple of months of practice, and hey, the numbers seem to be looking good. Statistics, hey, they're down. This we must be mitigating. Another buzzword. And so this must be good. This is best practices. Continue to do this, but we don't actually know that this is best practices. We could actually be hurting ourselves in the long term, right? We could be hurting our immune systems, for example, and making it easier, not just in terms of coronavirus, but in staying away from everybody. We're staying away from everything, which means that we could have a spike in the regular flu next year. Even if we don't have a coronavirus thing, we could have all sorts of things because we don't have any immunities that we're building up for other things. This could be worst practices, but it seems like best practices because we've got this little statistic over here that seems to work in the short term. And so best practices are very short-sighted. I'll give you some not related things like this that work like this. It would seem to be, if you're just a company looking at your bottom line, you're a new company, you're trying to make money, say, and you notice that you can cut a corner here. You can have maybe fudge a little bit on your quality control of your products. Make it not quite as nice a product. And in doing so, it saves you a little money. My bottom line is better. I'm making more of a profit. That's good practices. Best practices because it's saving me money. I can, maybe the customer service. We can kind of cut some corners there. I can have some guy in India that calls, you call a call center, and it gets shipped over there, and no one understands what he's trying to say when he's trying to walk me through this problem. He doesn't understand my problem. We have cultural differences, but it's cheaper, so best practices because I'm making money. So the reality, however, is in the long run, when I do these things, I'm going to develop a reputation as a company that doesn't care about my client, that doesn't stand behind my product, that whatever the case is. So in the long run, this was actually worst practices, but at the time it seemed to be best practices. And so this is why I say best practices is a wonderful sounding thing, but Jesus was not a big fan of best practices. There's a story before he even begins his ministry that I think is important, and it's in Matthew chapter 4. He goes up to the mountain to be tempted, and it's a thing, and this might be my personal interpretation, that's fine, but how I understand it, as Satan comes to him and he's testing him, and one of the tests is he shows him all the kingdoms of the world. I imagine that he meant the kingdoms or nations of the area from this high place where you could see multiple areas across Palestine. And he says, you can have all this. Now, we always interpret that to as Satan saying, here, you can have all the material wealth of these kingdoms and whatnot. And I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, because I think Satan knew a little bit more about Jesus. I think he was pretty closely acquainted with him to whatever degree, from going back thousands and thousands of years. I think that he knew what Jesus was about. Jesus came and he was about people, and I think what Satan's attempt to get Jesus to bow down to him was, you know that I control these people, essentially. I mean, I can't force them to do anything, but you know that right now they listen to me. Right? Jesus, all you got, and I know why you're here. You're here to get these people to listen to you, and your message is so wonderful, and all that. You know, I don't believe it, but I know you believe in it. So here's the deal: you just bow down to me, and I'll leave these people alone. I won't tempt them. I won't do anything. All these people are yours. How tempting that must have been, especially for Jesus, who knew what's coming. And to have no opposition. In the short term, that would have been best practices. If that was the nature of the temptation, again, that's conjecture, but if that was the nature of the temptation, that would have been best practices. No difficulties, no Pharisees hounding me all the time, no Sadducees, no lawyers always trying to stir these people up, and possibly no death and resurrection. That would be a bonus. All of these things, and I can think of how many people I could convince. Think of the numbers of people. It wouldn't seem like best practices to do it the hard way. And remember that after all this is said and done, after Jesus' life is all said and done, the day of Pentecost, there was 120 people still with him. For all that work, for 3 years of work and convincing crowds and doing miracles and all of this stuff, Jesus had 120 people that still gathered regularly and remembered him. Best practices. You want 120 people, or do you want a lot of people? I can leave it all alone. Best practices says things like, let's have rock concert church. Best practices says, let's, you know what we should do? We should have communion on Saturday night when it's convenient. Best practices says, let's have online church, and all the time, whether there's a quarantine or not. Let's just keep doing this thing. It works so wonderful. It never glitches during church service at all. It's so great. It's so cool. Technology is so awesome. we can just do this and just sit at home and have our little Jesus in a cup in our living rooms in our pajamas. This is awesome. That's best practices. Best practices says, let's lower the moral standard. Let's teach more about grace, because grace is nice. It's in the Bible, but let's talk less about moral requirements and holiness, and let's talk more about grace and forgiveness. That's going to be more appealing numerically. The statistics will be better, and it looks in the short term, but the problem is that when we do that, we will build a church that has lower resistance. We will build a church that doesn't have the immunities to the world around us. It will seem great statistically looking in the short term, but as we look to the long term of the church, it's going to have a church that has far more health problems than if we stick to what God wanted, which was, we're going to have to build up some immunities to the Satan and what he's trying to accomplish. And so, yes, for right now, Satan, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go ahead and deny what you are offering me, because I am going to look for something that's more permanent, even if that incurs a little pain in the short term. So try to be aware of those preaching best practices as we resume our normal church services.